The fourth pillar that holds up the focus group is analysis. And this is the one that kind of really depends on the other things. The interesting thing about analysis is we've had people come to us and show us what they have, and they were asking questions about analysis. But when we looked at what they had, how they captured the data, the questions they had, it was just about impossible to do analysis. Analysis kind of depends on how the other parts of it works. In other words, the questions. Did you ask the questions consistently, or did you keep changing the questions? One of the things we want to do is to have consistent questions, or if you do change them, just ever so slightly and under a fair amount of thought. So you have the ability to compare one group to the other. And so analysis depends upon how the moderator did their task. Did they follow up? Did they do all the things that were necessary to get the information? There are two words that are critical when we talk about analysis, and much of analysis sort of revolves around these two words. And by the way, this applies to both quantitative and qualitative analysis. I mean, in some ways, there's some similarities here. Both of them are systematic. That means there are a series of steps you follow. I mean, you've all had training in statistical kinds of things. You know that you just don't take a bunch of numbers and you say, oh, what am I going to do with these today? I'm going to be creative. I'll do some things that no one else has done. No, you don't do that, because what you want is it to be credible to other people who are looking at it. The same is true with qualitative analysis. You follow the protocol that have been established of how you handle the data, how you capture the data, how you document the data, how you code the data. All those things are necessary for you to be done in a systematic way. And here's the interesting thing. It's not only important for you to be systematic, but you have to be able to explain it to others. People will come to you and they'll say, how'd you do analysis? And what they're asking for is, what was the protocol? How did you do it? How did you go from this conversation to this written report? And what were the steps involved? What were the decisions that were involved along the way? And so you need to be able to articulate, to explain what that is.
Because what people are worried about is that you just picked the ideas that you liked, right? That's what they're worried about, you know, like, how did you do this? Like, did some kind of magic happen, or did you just like pull this out? So you have to be able to describe the process that you used.
Also, the second word is verifiable. Now, that's sort of like the little breadcrumbs you leave along the way, the trail of evidence that you have, and you maintain and you keep all of those. The reason is that if needed, you should be able to replicate each of the steps along the way. You have an audio recording. By the way, we really do like the audio recordings because they capture a great deal of information that's very hard to get when you're just trying to take notes. You can get the words that people use, the actual words. Sometimes the quote is long, but what we encourage, especially, we don't do every study this way, but we'll often go from here to a transcript, and then we'll basically do a content analysis of the transcript, of looking for patterns that are occurring along the way. But there's a series of steps. Someone could go back and verify each of those steps along the way. And part of this means there's some things that are done at different times. Like there's some things done while you're still in the focus group. What are those, Marianne?
I'm just going to back up for one second and say that depending upon what kind of a study we're doing, we don't always use the same process for analysis. If you're doing it for your dissertation, you're going to have a different analysis process than if you're doing it for the neighborhood newsletter. So
That's a
part
good
of what
point.
we're looking at is, how reversible are the the decisions, how big is the decision that's going to be made, what are the standards for what it is that you're doing. If you're doing it for a journal article or something, there are different expectations. So part of it is that we're looking at, what, for this particular study, what's the appropriate level of analysis that we're going to do. And when we're doing analysis, it's a little different in qualitative than quantitative. In quantitative, you often kind of wait until you have like lots of the data in before you start doing analysis. In quantitative, in focus groups, you start doing analysis while you're in the very first group. And as the moderator, what you're doing is you're thinking about, am I getting enough information on this? Do I need them to be more concrete? Do I need an explanation? So you're pushing for more data, more information that's going to be useful when you get to analysis.
In the literature, they call this emergent. And that's an important factor. That it's not so true in quantitative research, but in qualitative research, each time you do it, your understanding of knowledge about what's happening is increased. And so the process of analysis is emergent. As you go along, you know more and more insight about whatever it is you're looking at. And that usually occurs to a certain point where you reach what we call saturation. Right.
And then the way that we capture the data in the focus group is that we'll always have a note taker. And so whoever's doing the analysis should tell the note taker what kind of notes they want. Because sometimes if you just say take notes, you'll get like back minutes to a meeting, which is not helpful when you're trying to do analysis. And so whoever's doing the analysis should tell the note taker, or maybe you want the analyst to be the note taker.
Let me add to that. Like in the minutes of a meeting, you've all read minutes of a meeting. Rarely, if ever, do you see a quotation, someone actually saying something. However, in a transcript of a focus group, it's pretty much all quotations, direct comments said by people. That's the evidence you want to use when you're preparing the report. The summary is interesting, but it's the quotes that are the evidence you use to support those larger points.
So we've got the note taker. We've got the audio recording. You'll gather all the things that people produce. So if they drew something, if they made a list of something, if you've written things on the whiteboard, you'll take a photo of it. So you're gathering all the information. That's part of your data. You might have somebody in the back with a laptop. If it can be quiet, you might use somebody taking notes that way with a laptop. And then in market research, they'll use video. We don't recommend that for a lot of different reasons. But what you want to do is think about kind of those lower levels, that you've got the notes, you've got the audio recording, you've got all the information that people wrote or whatever, and that'll be your data stream. And then we often also ask a final question while we're still in the group that helps from an analysis standpoint. It's kind of that last question, Dick, of all the things we talked about here today, what's most important? Or if you had a minute to talk to the people who are designing this program, what advice would you give them? And you go around. So that's kind of what you do in the group from an analysis standpoint. And then right after the group, then you're going to do debriefing. Now, your first instinct will be to go home. Because it takes a lot of energy to do these. But resist that temptation and sit down together. And what you'll do is first you'll check the audio recording to make sure that you have something. If you don't, you'll go question by question and try to take as much notes as you can. But if you've got something, turn it back on. And now we'll have a conversation about what we should pay attention to in this group. So we'll think about what seemed to be the important ideas that came out of
No,
this.
this is called the debriefing.
Yep. So we're having this right after the focus group conversation, and it's what seemed to be important. Were there any quotes that seemed really kind of standout kind of quotes that we want to make sure and capture?
How did it differ from other groups? Were there any surprises in this one?
Is there anything that we need to change about recruiting? Anything that we need to change about the questioning route? Was there something that didn't work as well? So all of that will record. It might be a 15, 20-minute conversation, and then you can go home. But you can actually use that then. If somebody wants a summary of the focus group, you could just go back and transcribe some of that debriefing, and you'd have a pretty good kind of little summary of what went on.
What you're doing here is doing really a memory dump. That your memory is really good immediately after that group. 24 hours, it's going to fade. As soon as you do another group, it's going to erase almost completely. And so while your memory is still fresh, people have left the group, you sit down and you take it from your memory and you put it into another permanent form that you're not going to lose. And also, that's the first time that the members of the team are starting to talk with each other. And they might, in that conversation, that could even evolve into a higher level where they're talking about something, they're seeing something, they're observing something taking place. But that debriefing is a valuable part of the analytical process that you're going through.
And then, after that,
well, then so now the group is over, and you've got a bunch of material. You've got field notes, you've got audio recording, you've got a debriefing that's having afterwards. And then, now depending on the study, sometimes this decision is made earlier. It's a question of should you transcribe it or not. You know, if you're doing a dissertation, you're doing a major kind of a study where you're trying to get it published, it's a really important research study, the answer is almost always yes. You probably do need to transcribe. But if you're doing it for some community organization where speed is really important, they need results within 2 days, or the resources are really limited, they don't have the time or the resources to do it, it might be that you decide you're going to use another kind of a strategy.
Or if you're doing focus groups to pilot test something, often you can do the analysis based on the notes because you've given them 3 options and they like the middle option, but you need to tweak it in these ways. And you can often get enough information from your notes to do that kind of analysis on pilot
And so
testing.
here we're telling you now, good analysis. It's sort of like traveling from here to Chicago. There's more than one way of getting there. There's some that are faster and some that are longer, and there's some that are scenic and some by airplane and some by train. When you're doing focus group analysis, there's a number of ways of doing it, and some involve more risk. If you're doing it very quickly and you're not using transcripts, there can be a risk that you might overlook something. There are other times, though, that if you do put in all the time of going through a transcript, it will take you longer.
If you are going to do transcripts, get a transcription kit off Amazon. It is like a little foot pedal, and you attach it to your computer, and you can play back the recording as quickly or as slowly as you can type. And as long as you keep your foot down, it keeps going. As soon as you lift your foot up, it stops and it backs up a little bit. So you can keep your hands on the keyboard the whole time and you're not trying to push other buttons. It will speed up the transcription an enormous amount. And they're just called transcription kits. Comes with the foot pedal and a little bit of software. And it sounds, there's a lot of head nodding, so it sounds like you've used them. We recommend those highly. So
one of the things that we find is that some people, that when you're analyzing the focus groups, what you're doing is you're putting things into categories. It's sort of like what we call cleaning the closet or sorting the laundry. I think the sorting the laundry is a better one at our household because Marianne has one way of sorting, I have a different way of sorting. But we both have to do some sorting of the laundry. and it's putting similar things together. And the idea is that when you sort things, putting similar things together, you could, if you wanted, create labels or code. I don't do it with mine. I'm not sure what my labels would be.
We've got one.
No, it's actually, I think,
Light
two.
and dark.
No, I think it is like the real scudsy kind of jeans that are full of grease. They go in one. Everything else goes in the other one.
No.
Now yours, I found that when I was doing Mary Ann's laundry that, no, I cannot. I've got to look at the fabric. Now this was a whole new revelation for me. That fabric, I thought all fabric was fabric, but no, there is fabric you have to consider as well as color. And so analysis is sort of that, is that you're putting things into categories. In the literature, we call this a constant comparative. Actually, this comes out of the writings of Barney Glasser and Absalom Strauss. Do you want to explain what that is?
Well, constant comparative is, in order to do this, you would have transcripts. And so you would start with the very first transcript, and you start with the first question you're going to analyze, and you take the first quote, and you read it, and you ask yourself, does it answer the question? If it doesn't, does it answer a different question? You move it to that question. If it doesn't answer any question, you just set it to the side. But if it answers the question, then you say, okay, what's that about? You put it in a pile. You take the next quote, you read it, and you ask yourself the same things. Does it answer the question? Yes, no. Does it answer another question? And then if it does answer the question, you say, okay, is it the same thing as that first quote, or is it something else? If it's the same, you put it in the same pile. If it's talking about something else, you put it in a new pile. You constantly compare the new data to what you already have. That's the essence of constant comparative. That way there's no cherry picking. You just don't go in and pick out what you like, because you're looking at every bit of data and you're saying, what's this about? And do we already have that? And then you'll do that. You go question by question. You do that transcript. And then you pull the next transcript in and you do the very same thing. The next transcript, that group might have been a little different. So maybe you've got more categories. And then you just keep doing that. And then you might get to a point where you say, we've got too many categories for this, or these are related categories. So then you can kind of start playing with the categories. Or you might realize this pile is really big. This is really about a couple of different things. And so you can tease it apart. So it is what its name is. You're just constantly comparing the new bits of data to what you already have, and then you're giving them labels. You're
Coding.
saying,
It's basically coding is what
you're
you're
saying
doing.
this is about this, and you're giving it a label.
Now, what happens when you're doing coding, there's a couple things that are important, is that this is a process where it's often helpful to have a couple people with you. And it's especially if they were in the focus group itself. And when you look at the transcript together with someone else, and then you put things into categories and decide what the codes are. Sometimes you have to, subdivide the codes. Sometimes the codes are too broad. You don't know when you first start. You also kind of keep memos or keep track of what's the logic behind putting things into different categories, so you're consistent as you go through those. Now, then what happens is you basically, there's a couple ways of doing it. In our book and other places, we talk about a classical method where you're using flip charts and you just cut these things out and you tape them on a flip chart so you visually can see all your comments on this flip chart. Now,
so if you have a transcript, you can physically cut them apart. It's if you've never done qualitative analysis before, it's really a nice way to do it because it's a very concrete process and you can visualize what you're doing. If you've done it before, when I do analysis, I'm doing the very same thing, only I'm just doing it in Word using cut and paste. So I'm moving like things together in Word within the transcript. So,
And what some people have done is use Word and also Excel. That if you're familiar with how these programs work, Excel has some nice abilities to do some sorting and selection of things that Word doesn't have. And so what some people have done is they'll start in Word, move it to Excel, and then develop some codes and use that. Now, that is sort of the, well, for a better word, it's sort of the poor person's way of doing it. If you're a rich person, you can go with the fancy software programs, such as Apple,
Atlas TI,
Atlas TI,
and
and Vivo. Here, if you get them at a university, they can be not so expensive. But if you had to go out and buy those, it could be $800, $900 for software to do that. Basically, what this software does is that you have to still read it, you have to give it labels, and what the computer does is it puts it in a database and calls it up. The computer doesn't tell you what it means. You still have to look at that data and say, this is what that coded area, what that area means, and you have to describe it. The computer won't do that for you. And so some people ask the question, should I use a computer to help me? What we suggest is that if you're going to do these regularly and often, and you're going to use transcripts often, then you might want to take a look at some of these computer programs. There's a variety of them out there. The learning curve is steep. It takes you a while to get comfortable with them. But we can also tell you that people have done excellent kinds of analysis with focus groups without using these kinds of programs. Now, as you're looking at these programs, we should mention just the difference between frequency and extensiveness, that sometimes it's maybe part of our...
Well, you should just talk about counting.
Yeah, counting. Part of our DNA of being in universities is we tend to think of analysis as a process of counting. For some reason, this is the first thing that comes to mind. Okay, I can just count how many fit this category, how many fit that category, and then we make interesting assumptions that more means something than less, that more comments are more important.
That's the more important thing. You kind of automatically think, oh, the highest frequency must be the most important thing. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
That's an assumption you have to be careful with. In quantitative research, that's typically the assumption. More is better, usually. Is more insightful than less. And oftentimes in qualitative research, if you have only one case or a few cases, they're considered outliers. And we sort of set them aside because they mess up the statistics. That when you put them all together, it's like...
you mean in quantitative?
In quantitative, yeah. We kind of mess those up. And so we set them aside. Well, in qualitative, those outliers could be some of the most important bits of information. And so we don't set them aside. We examine the ones that are on the fringes. What do they tell us?
So,
is it something relevant, important that we need to... And even if you were doing a study and you had maybe 20, 25 people, but one person gave a point of view that was different. And based on the surrounding things, if you felt, based on the data you had and the environment and the other factors, that there was relevance, it may be that you actually discussed that in the report. That probably wouldn't be high on your findings, but you still may want to discuss it because it brings in some kind of insight to the phenomenon you're looking at.
I was going to say the same thing, that sometimes it will be that in an entire study, something is only said once, but you still kind of hold it up. It might be a little gem, and you hold it up and you say, this was said once, but for these reasons we think it's important to pay attention to this. Like sometimes you're doing a needs assessment and it's only said once, but there's only one person who is at the horizon to see that yet coming. And so if you're just swayed by the biggest frequency thing, you might be led off track. And so we might say, no one else said this, but is this something on the horizon that we better be paying attention to? So the whole idea of counting, whenever we see focus group reports and there's percentages in them, it always makes me a bit uncomfortable. Like, how did they do that? Because not everybody answers every question. So
now,
what are they using as a basis for that?
Let's think about the alternatives other than counting. Now, counting, we're not going to rule that out completely. That still has some, it might give us insight. But let me suggest something else. We call it intensity or passion. It's how people say things. What comes along with that communication? And that one of the things that we know is that when people feel strongly, when there's an intensity of their communication, oftentimes it may be more predictive of behavior than anything else they do. That we know that the connection between emotion and behavior is powerful, and that emotion tends to sway behavior and influence it in a number of ways. And so if you're trying to study and examine why people do things or not do things, one of the things to think about is, well, where was the energy? Where was the passion? Were there times and places where people got excited, aroused, angry? Now that actually may not show up in the transcript. I mean, it may be body language, things that are happening in the focus group. If that does happen, try to get them to describe it a bit more so that you do have a quote or something. What you want is someone to say, I am so angry at how this is, whatever it is. But the quote is something then you can put into the report.
But also just what we're often looking for from an analysis standpoint is the emotion. And what you're looking for is there a change in how that person is responding?
Yep.
Do they get louder? Do they bang their fist? Do they get softer? Do they cry? Does everybody start talking at once?
Yeah.
That tells you something.
Another indicator that's going to be helpful for you is what we call specificity. That means how much detail are they able to give you on what they're talking about. And that when people have had a very direct experience and a vivid experience, oftentimes they remember the details. And so as you're asking someone, they're talking about something, you say, tell me more about it. How do they talk about it when you ask that? Do they give you chapter and verse? Do they give you exact kinds of details? Or do they talk in a very general way? Now, it's not that you discount the general, but when you hear specific, your ears perk up and you listen very carefully because this had a vivid impression on them and it's something very likely very connected to their being and their behavior.
So when we hear the kind of specific concrete from an analysis standpoint, we give that more weight.
So these are things, that you need to weigh a number of things. Not just how often or how many different people.
Like,
Intensity, specificity. And these are some of the things that you have to sort of be there in the group.
That is one of the keys to analysis.
Let me tell you that one little anecdote about, we were doing something a couple years ago in one of the suburbs here of St. Paul. The issue was on solid waste disposal and should you have one garbage hauler or many garbage haulers in the communities. St. Paul now is facing that very same issue in a number of communities. What we discovered, we were asked by Washington and Ramsey County to go into some of the communities and do focus groups. What surprised us were some of the residents came in who were very emotional about this topic. Now, in our neighborhood, we're not too emotional about garbage haulers. I mean, we just like it to be gone, and that's a good idea. And there are many garbage trucks going up and down our alley. But what we found in these groups are people that were pounding their hands on the table, talking about how important it was for them to hire their own personal garbage hauler. That was an American freedom that they wanted to preserve, and they didn't want it taken away by some level of government. We were a bit surprised at that. The advice we gave to the communities were back away from this one, because the emotion is too intense. People are going to fight this issue. Most of the people could care less, but there was a strong faction. The same thing is happening right now in St. Paul and other communities that are studying it. And partly it's because garbage haulers are sort of agitating. And they're sending out messages to their customers saying, you want to be sure to hire your own personal garbage hauler, because this is an American freedom that people have fought and died for.
No, they actually brought in letters, and like the borders were American flags, and
yeah,
so,
protect your freedoms. And you know, and it's like that was a very important discovery.
But what's important about this is, if you were in those focus groups, you got a kind of visceral feeling about the amount of energy and passion people had around this topic. If you were trying to do analysis just from the transcripts, all that's gone, right? You have no idea, like, that they were pounding their fists. And, you know, sure, the transcriptionist could put that in there. It's not the same as having been in the group. So what we recommend is whoever's doing the analysis should be in as many of those groups as possible. Because things happen.
People will cry. People will get angry.
And we've got a friend who does a lot of focus groups around public health things. She actually says that she feels as though they haven't gotten to the heart of the matter until somebody cries. Now, we're not trying to get people to cry in ours, but it is something to pay attention to, that you probably are getting at something.
And you know, that's one of the uniquenesses of focus groups compared to other forms of research. I mean, I've never seen anyone get angry or cry over a survey or an individual interview. I mean, maybe they got angry, but in a focus group, I don't mean to say that it happens all the time, but it is interesting that every once in a while there is an emotional overtone, and that is an important bit of information that's very useful if you're trying to design programs, put things together. It could be things that people are fearful of, people that are concerned about, any number of things. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of analysis. Let's stop now and see if there's some questions on analysis. Or over here, you got one?
No.
Oh.
I have one for, it's not analysis of what we discussed earlier, like besides analysis.
Oh, she had earlier brought up this idea that when you do focus groups, you often raise expectations that you're actually going to do something. This is important, because if you're working in communities and you keep going out and asking them for information and they don't see that anything's different or don't get a follow-up, they don't know what you did, they begin to not want to play your game anymore, right? So one of the things that we recommend is that when you are doing focus groups, keep track of who shows up. And then what we do is send out a thank you letter, or we call it a thank you report. And so we'll send out, and often again, we want to have this signed by somebody who they know and respect within the organization. But we say thank you for participating. We heard you. Here are the top 3 things that we learned. Based on that, here's what we're going to do. We also heard this, and right now we can't do anything about that. Kind of explain that, especially if there was some big thing that came up and you can't do anything about it. And then we'll say we've included an executive summary of the report. If you want more information, here's the name and phone number of somebody to contact. And again, thanks for participating.
No, that's helpful. To me, though, I've gotten burnt on this one, and there are times where organizations, I mean, I've been asked by, Hennepin County Health, the state of Minnesota, foundations, the University of Minnesota, to all go into indigenous communities and ask questions, and there's been no follow-up. And my new philosophy on this is that before I say yes to any of them, I'm going to extract a promise that they're going to monitor it and stay in touch. In other words, it isn't just the letter afterwards, but that on a regular basis, somebody stays in touch with that group and tells them what progress. Because I know that, like, when the university did something with the American Indian community, we did this big listing, nothing ever happened. Now, the university was studying it. Heck, we like to study things for years before anything happens. And that was what was happening. And they interpreted that as being indifference. And it wasn't the immediate report, it was 2 years, 3 years later. Somebody should have been in touch with them and said, we're continuing to look at this, and we'd like to have more conversations. And so some of these, if you're working for an organization, get people high enough up to say, we're going to make a commitment. If we're going, it's not just a one-shot Band-Aid, okay, we've done our dues now, to whatever it is. It's a commitment. If you're going to start it, and you carry it through, not just today, but next year and the year afterwards. And I think that's how you build trust within a community, instead of fly by night, which so often we do.
Well, I was saying I've been doing these listening sessions, and it's raised a emotion in me about feeling an obligation to,
Yep.
because people get excited, like, oh, you're asking me for my ideas about things to do. Oh, you're going to do something.
And then they get ticked off when nothing happens. I don't blame them.
I want to
Yeah.
see it carried through.
Okay, analysis question back here.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really sure if this is even possible, but I'm just thinking about, as you're capturing like the emotional information and trying to analyze it, any advice for doing that like in an objective way? Because I'm just thinking about, and maybe it's hard to do that because it is so subjective, but trying to sort of interpret people's emotions or actions, and maybe, I don't know, I'm even just thinking about implicit biases that might be.
Well, I would encourage you to keep thinking about this, because this is a good topic. One of the things you might use, and we've thought about it from time to time, is that scale that your physician uses on how much pain do you feel. On a 10-point scale, where's your pain today? And there are times where if I would see someone showing some kind of an emotion, I would say, where is that on, let's say that, I'm not sure, I can't think fast enough to do it, but I would have probably used that on these people with solid waste. Is like, okay, if you're talking about your frustration with having one hauler, where would you place that? With 10 being really frustrated and one I don't care. Where would you be sort of emotionally on a 10-point scale? I don't know. I've not done it enough to know if that would work, but something like that, where I could go back and say, okay, this ranks a 7 on a 10-point scale. I think that kind of insight to a reader would say, oh, I better pay attention to that. All I can tell you is up in Maplewood, there's a bunch of mostly men, older men, who are really enraged on this topic. I don't know how many, I don't know what percentage it would be, but I do know the logic they use. And I don't think they're going to change very easily. They seem to be really dug in, and I would bet the same is happening in St. Paul, that the people are locked in a position, and it's going to be a question of how do we get people to move on this, or how do the city leaders move forward when you have such strength. But I'd keep thinking about how you might do it, because I think that if you can come up with a strategy, that would be very insightful. Any other Yes.
So when you're writing your analysis and you had a note taker taking notes that somebody said something and people are nodding, or some of that energy in the room, is that something you ever do include in your reports?
Yes. Yes. One of the things we'll have someone watch for is like head nods, but usually the moderator will try to we'll see the head nods and we'll try to get someone to verbalize it. Like I see some head nods. Would someone like to comment on that? And because what you would like to do is to get a verbal comment more than get it out of just the banging into a verbal thing so that you can use it in a report. Just saying someone is waving their hands, gesturing wildly, may not be enough. You want to get
Yeah,
it
because
as
that is your. It's back to your point. It's your interpretation of what that means, and you could be totally wrong. So you, as much as you can as the moderator, what you're trying to do is have them talk about it.